Exalted Blade was one of the first Exalted weapons, though funnily enough it wasn't even always part of Excalibur's kit. Back in the day, Radial Javelin was his ultimate, and he had Super Jump as his third ability, but after Parkour 2.0, that got dumpstered with Excalibur's rework in Update 16.9. Surprisingly, Exalted Blade wasn't actually the first Exalted. That title seems to belong to Valkyr's Hysteria, but this ability is so iconic that the entire category of ability it occupies would go on to bear its name. The term Exalted Weapon would really catch on after the Sacrifice, as that's when they became moddable separately from other weapons, but even so, this ability's release was equal parts rework and revolution. While it does have some idiosyncrasies on account of its age, it's still able to perform impressively today, and its sound design is still incredible. I have a confession to make real quick. Sometimes I recast this ability just to hear the cast sound. So, Exalted Blade is a longsword type weapon granted to Excalibur when using his fourth ability of the same name. The weapon consists of two components, the sword itself and the waves, which are beams of light fired by the blade with each attack. These waves have the same stats as the main blade and travel for 2.5 seconds at a rate of 15 meters per second, despawning after traveling 37.5 meters. These waves also have infinite punch through, meaning you can hit enemies through terrain and other enemies with them. The waves also do not contribute to the combo counter, though Exalted Blade doesn't have a ton of use for combo anyways. Because the blade and waves are separate, you can hit with them both at the same time, effectively dealing double the damage and double dipping on things like status and crit chance, as well as mods like Shattering Impact. Heavy attacks don't release any wave, though air attacks do release waves that have a 300% damage boost from the stance. I don't think it's exactly intuitive to play like this, but hey, it's noteworthy, I guess. Slide attacks will also release a wave before doing a small radial blind, blinding enemies in 5 meters for 6 seconds at the cost of 25 energy. This slide blind doesn't open enemies to finishers though, which is kinda weird. This blind is actually worse in terms of energy cost per meter than Radial Blind and Howl, so I personally wouldn't recommend using it outside of some very specific scenarios. Exalted Blade is also always affected by Excalibur's 10% passive damage and attack speed boost for swords, which isn't really that good, but it's a thing, I guess. Taking a look at the stance, it overall isn't that bad, but it's not great either. It's got okay modifiers on a few combos and some forced lifts and ragdolls, but nothing is terribly standout as far as stances go. Many of its combos are kinda awkward and sluggish in my opinion, so let's talk about them real quick. The neutral combo is the highest damage combo, at the cost of a sort of start-stop feeling between its two halves. The regular forward combo has no multipliers at all, in exchange for flowing very well, completing very quickly, and keeping Excalibur surprisingly mobile. Personally, this combo is my favorite, and the one I use the vast majority of the time. The block combo forces ragdolls and has big arcing hits at the cost of a lot of downtime between attacks. Lastly, the forward block combo carries you really far on its first swing and forces impact procs on enemies it hits, but it also feels very start-stop and has the worst DPS of any combo. I do want to point out that the multipliers on the blade itself and on the waves it shoots are separate, which will be important here in a bit. Moving on to the stats, Exalted Blade deals 250 base damage, scaling with power strength, and drains 2.5 energy per second. The damage type spread is 70% slash and 15% impact and puncture, which is alright, but nothing amazing. This damage type spread doesn't even matter in many builds, but I'll elaborate on why in a little bit. It has 2.8 meters of range, which is above average for a sword weapon, and a full follow-through at 1, which is quite good. Unfortunately, beyond those stats, we start running into issues pretty quickly. The critical chance and status chance of Exalted Blade are both only 15%, and the critical multiplier is average at 2 times. Those crit and status chances are especially hurt by the lack of Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds, which make it difficult to bump them up through mods. Exalted Blade is also quite slow with an attack speed of 0.83. So that's not great, but the waves make up for the low stats, right? Well, kind of, but they have their own problems. You see, Excalibur comes from a time when digital extremes cared about this thing called balance, and as such, Exalted Blade has several severe limitations, even beyond the ones all Exalteds possess. Most of these tie into the waves, which may sound good on paper, but behind the scenes, they haven't just been kneecapped, all of their limbs have been completely removed. So, one of the biggest issues with the waves is that they're susceptible to damage fall off. They appear to fall off linearly in damage as they travel, meaning that if you hit an enemy that's half the maximum travel distance of the wave from you, the wave will only deal half its total damage. This fall off starts immediately, meaning even a distance of only a few meters will already start to be subjected to this scaling. Okay, real quick, I need to go on a brief rant. The Warframe wiki says that there's some kind of breakpoint after 6.5 meters where the damage plummets to 28% instantly, and the last time I tested this was true, but as I was working on this video, it seems like at some point it was changed to be linear without this massive drop in damage. I can't find any patch notes about this, but all of my testing seems to show this 6.5 meter breakpoint just doesn't exist. I just wanted to clarify that fact for anybody else who might read the wiki page, as I now have to record this section in post because I got duped. The falloff isn't the only issue with the waves, though. Even worse, odds are you aren't ever going to actually be reaching the full range of the waves. Remember how I mentioned that the waves have a projectile lifetime of 2.5 seconds? Well, every time a wave hits an enemy, that wave loses a whole half second off of its lifespan, which takes 7.5 meters of distance from the wave every time it does its job of hitting an enemy. Even worse for the waves is the stance, which has a weird recurring quirk. For many of the attacks that gain a damage boost from the stance, the wave that attack releases either has a worse damage multiplier, or just doesn't get one at all. The waves do have one important trick up their sleeve though. For whatever reason, Condition Overload's damage bonus applies to them twice, which can help make up for the damage falloff. Between these pretty heavy-handed dampers and the double-dipping nature of the blade itself having a hitbox, Exalted Blade is in this weird situation where you'd think it's a melee that you're able to use at range, but in reality, you want to use it like pretty much every other sword, hugging enemies close enough to hit with both blade and wave while minimizing the amount of damage you lose to fall off. If anything, it's just a sword with abnormally good range. I want to make it clear, I'm not trying to say you can't play around to the ranged element of Exalted Blade. If you deal enough damage to kill an enemy 10 times over, then reducing it by this much really won't matter. But I want to make you aware that if you are going to go down that route, there are a lot of very severe limitations to be aware of. Okay, so between the subpar stats and the waves being taken out back and shot, Exalted Blade probably sounds pretty bad. But before the Excalibur players post my address in the comments section, don't worry, this ability is still very powerful when built correctly, despite showing so much age. For one, the base damage scaling with strength is already very powerful, and the high follow-through and waves double dipping on hits are still very good. Obviously these aren't enough to carry the weapon though, so what can we do to help it out? Well, let's circle back to the crit and status stats. These both aren't good out of the gate, but we've got ways around that. Excalibur Umbra's variation of Exalted Blade, while statistically identical to regular Excaliburs, does have a unique advantage. It comes with 2 Umbral polarities pre-installed. With a maxed out sacrificial pressure in steel, we get our critical chance to just above 55%. Why is that important? Well, because with Arcane Avenger, you get a flat crit bonus of 45% when you get hit, 21% of the time at least, which gets Exalted Blade to just above 100%, making it crit very consistently. The crit multiplier still isn't fantastic, but it's more than workable, especially if you have red or purple Archon shards to slot in with the crit damage bonus selected. Your choice of companion can help carry the weak critical stats too, as an Adarza Kavat can provide another flat 60% crit chance alongside a 1.2 times crit multiplier boost from Tenacious Bond. If you're fine with juggling 2 combo counters, you can also amp it up using the Gladiator set on your regular melee and building up its combo count. Just know you'll have to switch back and forth a fair bit unless you're using Power Spike on Naramon. If you're willing to sacrifice an ability, you can also use Wrathful Advance from the Helmet, which when stacked with high strength gives Exalted Blade some easy crit tiers. You just, have to find a non-helmet way to not disintegrate when an enemy so much as looks at you. Okay, so that's the crit part handled, but what about the status? Well, that's where Exalted Blade's augment comes in, Chromatic Blade. You remember how I said that the blade being 70% slash kinda didn't matter? This augment is why. Excalibur turns all of his physical damage into one of 4 primary elements based on his first emissive color, and his status chance is increased by a whopping 300%. Even better, this status chance bonus increases with power strength, which allows this mod to single-handedly carry Exalted Blade to 100% status at 189% strength. Of course, there are some serious considerations with this augment. It locks you into heat, cold, toxin, or electricity at the cost of all your physical damage, and while you can combine the primary elements into other secondary elements, it's still important to note that you're losing all of your IPS. The augment also kinda messes with your fashion, which is annoying to say the least. I think any drawbacks are more than worth it though, as the massive status chance increase is just such a large boost to Exalted Blade's power. Now, some people argue very hard that this augment is actually bad for a few reasons I find kinda silly, and I want to dissect them a bit real quick. The first and most obvious one is that Exalted Blade loses access to slash procs, but I don't really think that's a big deal. After Jade Shadows, enemy armor can't get higher than 90% damage reduction, so outright bypassing it isn't nearly as important as it used to be. I also feel like, even if armor still was uncapped, in most circumstances, landing 4 or 5 heat procs with a viral or 2 in the mix will deal more damage than a slash proc every now and again. People also say this augment is bad because it gives you less status effects for condition overload, which is absolutely true, and is especially noteworthy with the waves double dipping on CO. Thing is, if you're inflicting way fewer status effects to begin with, then it kinda doesn't matter, because you're probably not going to inflict enough unique status effects to make the damage increase even noticeable. If you're using Sacrificial Pressure for the set bonus with Steel, you probably won't be using Condition Overload anyways, as they're both base damage mods, but the double dipping on the waves on top of the lack of other mods to create competition means that running them together isn't actually that bad of an idea. The last argument I hear against Chromatic Blade is in favor of using Shattering Impact, which this mod does lock you out of, but I don't really think Shattering Impact is that good on Exalted Blade in the first place. Don't get me wrong, it's a great mod, and the double dipping from the waves makes it twice as good, but most enemies have high enough base armor that it just takes way too many hits to justify both taking up a slot on Exalted Blade and foregoing such a powerful augment. For reference, a regular Elite Lancer has 200 base armor, meaning that if both the wave and blade connect for 12 armor lost per hit, it would take 17 hits to fully remove that armor, and at that point, ideally they'd be dead. I've seen people reply to this argument by saying that they can kill acolytes fast, so here's me doing that with Chromatic Blade. I rest my case. Okay, sorry to shadowbox against critics who probably aren't even real, but I wanted to give that spiel to explain why I think Chromatic Blade is worth taking despite its downsides. Unless your main goal is to look cool, then you might not like it that much. So, of the 4 primary elements, which one do you choose? It's heat. You're probably just gonna choose heat. Heat removes 50% of enemy armor over 2 seconds, deals damage over time, makes enemies panic as a form of crowd control, and can be run with viral, which makes enemy health take way more damage. Other options are still totally viable, but I can't deny that viral heat is just a pretty tough combo to beat. I do want to talk about the other elements though, just to make their case. Cold damage can be helpful for combining into other elements, spawning energy orbs with Archon Flow, or for more survivability through crowd control, but normally you'll want your status weighting to be in favor of a damage over time effect, which is much easier to accomplish if you use one of the other 3 elements. Toxin is very good both against the Corpus and in conjunction with Archon Continuity, though it locks you out of using viral damage unless you're using Nourish, which is a sizable damage loss. Electric is a 3 meter AoE that also deals its first damage tick instantly instead of after a 1 second delay like Toxin and Heat, but you may need some other answer to armor when using it. Archon Stretch also can't regenerate energy for Excalibur while Exalted Blade is active, so the channel nature of the ability also locks you out of a very powerful use of electric damage. Back on the topic of heat, if you're willing to part with an Umbral Polarity on Excalibur, or just find some way to swing it, Archon Vitality can also double the heat procs inflicted by Exalted Blade. I don't think it's at all necessary, but it's absolutely worth noting. While I do find Viral and Heat to be the easy answer to dealing loads of damage, I do absolutely encourage you to experiment. For some alternative element combos, Toxin and Magnetic is very potent against the Corpus, Corrosive and Cold is very good against armored targets, and Blast and Electric is very good for stacking damage status effects and giving a small AoE to Exalted Blade's attacks. Nourish can be taken from the Helminth to make up for the downside of Viral not being in any of these setups, or you can use an external primer like Diraga's Arc Coil, a Panzer Vulpaphyla, or Epitaph. Blast and Toxin can also be a fun combo, especially with Archon Continuity for corrosive procs, and you can get extra silly with stuff like Radiation and Cold for maximum crowd control, or Gas and Electric for more AoE shenanigans. Just because Viral and Heat is an easy way to be very strong, doesn't mean these combos aren't both viable and really fun, so give them a shot and see what you like the most. Also, as a niche piece of tech, the Arthur Gemini skin allows you to swap your Chromatic Blade element mid-mission if you have a different one tied to his energy color. I don't know if this is really that practical, but it's certainly funny. Do I think Chromatic Blade is mandatory on Excalibur? Not exactly, but I do think it is extremely powerful and absolutely worth using. Okay, so we've solved the low critical and status chance, so what's left to tune up? Well, the waves are a lost cause, so just hug enemies and abuse the double dipping hits while the wave damage is actually good. As for attack speed, it's not that bad, and mods like Quickening, Primed Fury, and Berserker Fury are plenty in my experience. If you'd rather not spend a mod slot on attack speed, Arcane Strike or even Warcry are also valid alternatives. Alright, so now we've addressed the biggest issue with Exalted Blade. Critical chance being boosted by Avenger, a Crit Cat, or even Wrathful Advance, the status being boosted by Chromatic Blade, and the attack speed being bumped by one of the many ways to do so. Again, I treat the waves like a built-in melee duplicate, as, ironically, they aren't really great at a distance. So, we've got the weapon itself sorted, but you have to remember, This isn't just any weapon, it's attached to Excalibur, which means the rest of his abilities absolutely should be considered when evaluating its power. So let's talk about the two major power increases that Excalibur can get out of his wider kit: Radial Blind and Furious Javelin. Radial Blind is pretty simple all things considered. When enemies are blinded by it, they take bonus damage because the game considers Excalibur to be in stealth. Basically, in Warframe, you deal up to 700% more damage if an enemy is not aware of you, either because they haven't detected you or they can't see you. This boost stacks additively with critical damage, and visually appears yellow like critical hits do. So blinding enemies with your 2 causes them to take much more damage while also keeping Excalibur safe from being run through the shredder. Radial Blind also opens enemies to finishers, which can combo well with certain on-finisher effects, like Arcane Ultimatum, Inadem's damage reduction, and the ability's own Radiant Finish augment. In fairness, you can drop Radial Blind and rely on the Slide Attack Blind if you're going to be using a Helmet ability, as that also makes enemies take the bonus stealth damage. Just keep in mind that the Slide's range isn't very good out of the box, and it gets less energy efficient in terms of energy cost per meter, and again, you get no finishers. The other big damage bump for him is the Furious Javelin augment for his Radial Javelin ability, which grants him 15% more melee damage for every enemy hit by a javelin for the next 16 seconds. The buff duration and damage bonus scale with duration and strength mods respectively, but at a glance I imagine that 15% doesn't sound like a lot. But this mod has a trick up its sleeve. This damage bonus is multiplicative, meaning it applies after your mods, much like Mirage's Eclipse. Beyond that, Furious Javelin has no cap as a Veil Breaker, meaning that if you're in a room with 40 enemies within line of sight of Excalibur, you're about to get 40 stacks of that 15% damage boost. Unfortunately, this damage increase isn't refreshable, as every recast of Furious Javelin will roll a new buff value based on how many enemies you hit in that cast, but even in spite of that, it's still really good. I know it can be tough to stomach fitting 2 augments onto a build, but I do absolutely think it's a worth it use of space to take both Chromatic Blade and Furious Javelin. You'll get very impressive numbers out of this ancient-ass ability. While this is more of a footnote, I know some people also like to use Surging Dash with Exalted Blade to build up high combo multipliers for heavy attacks. This strategy is mostly employed to blow up acolytes, and I don't think they're that hard to kill without it, but I still wanted to bring the tactic up. Okay, so with all the pieces in place, we can get an idea of how to get the most out of Exalted Blade. Use Radial Blind for stealth multipliers and crowd control, Furious Javelin for more damage, Chromatic Blade for more status and elemental damage, and leverage both flat crit chance bonuses to maximize your critical chance, and external crit damage bonuses to maximize your critical multiplier. So that's all well and good, but as you've probably noticed from my frequent foreshadowing, Excalibur has a problem. He's about as durable as a fucking Walmart receipt. You can solve this issue by just throwing Gloom on him and calling it a day, but having 2 channeled abilities on top of using Furious Javelin and Radial Blind can be taxing on his energy economy, so I want to point out a couple ways to help this issue without relying on the Helminth. One of the most common and popular ways to heal on Excalibur is by placing Healing Return on Exalted Blade, which is surprisingly effective. You may only have 2 or 3 status types when Chromatic Blade is on, sure, and 11 health is pretty low, but the waves actually come in clutch here. Because they travel through enemies, they can hit a lot more of them than a normal melee, which can turn into a lot of healing. The mediocre range damage doesn't matter much here, because the healing has nothing to do with damage, so the ranged element of the ranged laser shooting sword is actually useful again. Another popular strategy is to use Life Strike, sometimes alongside the aforementioned Surging Dash augment, or even Tennokai for a faster activation and other bonuses. Do note that the waves can't activate Tennokai, only the main blade can, and Excalibur doesn't really have any reason to preserve his combo counter, so he doesn't need to use a Tennokai mod. Arcane Reaper is also really good on Excalibur for boosting his armor and healing rate, and while it's not a lot on its own, it absolutely is a great base to work with in combination with another strategy. Adaptation is also really good for making your health bar go farther by making you take less damage overall. Adaptation is generally better than Umbral Fiber for survivability on Umbra, at the cost of the set bonus it adds, though you can combine the 2 if you want them to multiply together. All of this work, or you could just bite the bullet and take Gloom. These suggestions are just scratching the surface of this topic, and there are loads of other potential strategies you can employ to survive, like shield gating, high range for crowd control, and even other Helminth abilities. My goal here isn't to be super comprehensive, but rather to give you some ideas on how to alleviate the struggles of Excalibur's glass bones and paper skin using Exalted Blade itself. I also want to mention that, while the wiki says you can use Exodia Might on Exalted Blade, my testing shows that it doesn't work, which really sucks. You can trigger the arcane by getting finishers with Exalted Blade, but you won't actually have any lifesteal until you switch back to your Zaw, so I'm tossing that idea in the bin. So that's Exalted Blade, a wave-shooting sword of light with a bit of a confused identity. It absolutely shows its age, from its subpar stats to its numerous heavy-handed limitations on its central gimmick, but with the right setup and planning, it can be an impressive and powerful weapon. Excalibur himself is a very powerful melee platform, despite his propensity towards being turned into sawdust, and Exalted Blade can leverage that power to look surprisingly modern despite being nearly 10 years old.